the man who runs the world's largest liquefied natural gas operation, walked into a room with U.S. officials and told them, directly, repeatedly, almost daily, that what was coming would be catastrophic. They heard him. They did nothing. Qatar's energy minister and Qatar Energy CEO Saad al-Khabi has now confirmed publicly that he warned the United States Secretary of Energy, American oil and gas executives, and senior Trump administration officials, in explicit terms, that an attack on Iranian energy infrastructure would trigger retaliatory strikes on Qatar's facilities. He said he raised this warning almost every single day. He said the consequences would be detrimental. He said restraint on energy infrastructure was not a preference, it was a requirement. Israel struck Iran's South Pars gas field anyway. Iran hit Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city within hours. Extensive damage confirmed. 17% of Qatar's entire LNG export capacity destroyed. Repairs projected to take 3 to 5 years. Oil crossed $110 a barrel. European gas prices rose 35% in a single day. And Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States knew nothing about the Israeli strike. U.S. and Israeli officials told CNN and Axios he approved it himself. That sequence, the warning ignored, the strike approved, the denial posted, the market in freefall, is what this analysis is going to walk through. Because what happened in the last 72 hours is not simply a military escalation. It is a compounding institutional failure with consequences that will reach your energy bill, your supply chain, and the economic stability of every country that imports fuel from this region. And that is most of the world. Subscribe to From Analysis right now and turn on notifications. The energy dimension of this conflict is where the strategic and economic consequences converge, and it is the dimension that daily military coverage consistently underweights. That gap is exactly what this channel is built to close. Saad al-Khabi's statement to Reuters on March 20th requires precise documentation, because what he described is not a diplomatic complaint issued after the fact. It is a documented record of explicit advance warning delivered to the highest levels of the American energy and national security apparatus, and then disregarded. Al-Khabi said he was always warning, talking to executives from oil and gas companies partnered with Qatar, talking to U.S. Secretary of Energy Chris Wright, warning him of the consequences. He said he told them almost on a daily basis that restraint on oil and gas facilities was essential. He said they were aware of the threat. He said he reminded them almost daily. He said the attack would be detrimental to Qatar. The White House spokesperson's response to al-Khabi's statement was that Trump and his energy team were not ignorant of the reality that there would be short-term disruptions to oil and gas. Short-term disruptions. Al-Khabi described 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity destroyed, repairs taking 3 to 5 years, force majeure being considered on long-term contracts to Belgium, China, Italy, and South Korea. Cold boxes, the cooling mechanisms that purify and chill gas for liquid transport, completely destroyed. He said, and the precision of this phrase carries its own weight, the cold boxes are gone. That is not a short-term disruption. That is the physical destruction of critical infrastructure that took years to build, will take years to replace, and whose absence will be felt in European homes, Asian factories, and global energy markets for the duration of that repair window. The gap between the White House characterization of short-term disruptions and Qatar Energy's documented assessment of 3 to 5 years of lost export capacity is not a matter of perspective. It is a factual divergence of extraordinary magnitude, and it was entirely predictable, because the man running Qatar Energy predicted it, explicitly, almost daily, to the people who made the decision anyway. Now the sequence of statements from Washington, because this sequence is doing specific institutional work that requires examination. On Wednesday, March 18th, Israel struck Iran's South Pars gas field, the world's largest natural gas reserve, containing an estimated 1,800 trillion cubic feet of gas, enough to supply global needs for 13 years. The field is shared between Iran and Qatar. Any significant strike on the Iranian side creates immediate consequences for Qatar's operations on the other side of the same reservoir. Iran retaliated within hours. Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, the hub through which nearly all of Qatar's LNG passes before export, was struck. Extensive damage confirmed. Saudi Arabia's refineries in Riyadh were hit. Kuwait's gas units were targeted. UAE's Habshan facility came under attack. Then Trump posted on Truth Social. He wrote that Israel, out of anger for what had taken place in the Middle East, had violently lashed out at South Pars. He wrote that the United States knew nothing about this particular attack. He wrote that Qatar was in no way, shape, or form involved, nor did it have any idea it was going to happen. The framing of violently lashed out is doing specific institutional work. It positions Israel as acting impulsively and independently, without American knowledge or coordination. It separates Washington from the strategic decision that triggered the retaliatory strikes that are now destroying the energy infrastructure of America's Gulf partners. One Israeli official told CNN the strike was carried out in coordination with the U.S. 3 people familiar with the planning told Axios that Trump approved the strike, that Netanyahu and Trump coordinated directly, that the aim was to deter Iran from continuing to disrupt oil supply through the Strait of Hormuz. Trump knew. Then he posted that he knew nothing, and Qatari officials, who had contacted White House envoy Steve Witkoff, CENTCOM commanders, and senior Trump administration officials demanding to know whether the U.S. had prior knowledge, were left conducting emergency calls trying to reach the president, whose administration had just approved the strike that brought Iranian missiles onto their gas facilities. The framing of American ignorance is not credible. The pattern of that framing, claiming no prior knowledge of decisions that multiple sources confirm were coordinated at the highest level, is itself an analytical data point about the institutional posture Washington has adopted toward the costs this conflict is imposing on its own partners. To understand the full weight of what Qatar's damage means, you need to understand the architecture of global LNG supply, because most coverage is treating Ras Laffan as a regional story when its consequences are structurally global. Qatar is the world's second-largest LNG supplier after the United States. Nearly all of its production passes through Ras Laffan Industrial City before export. The facility processes gas from Qatar's North Dome, its side of the South Pars Reservoir, and converts it into liquefied form for tanker transport to Europe, Asia, and beyond. Since Russia severed gas supply to Europe through the Ukraine war, Qatar's LNG has been one of the primary replacement sources for European households and industry. Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands. These economies rebuilt their energy security architecture around Gulf LNG as an alternative to Russian pipeline gas. Al-Khabi confirmed that 2 of Qatar's 14 LNG trains are damaged. One of its 2 gas-to-liquids facilities is damaged. 12.8 million tons per year of LNG capacity is sidelined for 3 to 5 years. He said he may have to declare force majeure on long-term contracts to Belgium, China, Italy, and South Korea. Force majeure, the legal declaration that a party cannot fulfill its contractual obligations due to circumstances beyond its control, on contracts supplying gas to 4 major economies simultaneously. European gas prices rose 35% in a single day when the damage was confirmed. Oil crossed $110 a barrel. Saudi officials are projecting prices could reach $180 per barrel if disruptions persist into late April. The Pentagon is requesting an additional $200 billion in emergency defense spending to fund and resupply U.S. operations. And the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of all globally traded oil passes, remains effectively closed to Western commercial shipping. Every one of those figures compounds the others. Higher oil prices increase the cost of every manufactured good that requires transportation. Higher gas prices increase the cost of heating, electricity generation, and industrial production across Europe and Asia. Supply chain disruptions from Hormuz closure increase delivery times and logistics costs globally. This is not a regional energy story. It is a global economic stress event triggered by a sequence of decisions whose consequences were explicitly predicted in advance and implemented regardless. The official characterization of this conflict from Washington has maintained a consistent posture since February 28. The operation is proceeding according to plan. Iranian capability is degraded. Energy disruptions are short-term. The alliance with Gulf partners remains solid. The operational and economic record describes something structurally different. Qatar's energy minister warned almost daily of catastrophic consequences. The strike that triggered those consequences was approved at the highest level. The denial of that approval was posted publicly within hours of the strike. Qatar's LNG capacity is sidelined for 3 to 5 years. Force majeure is being considered on contracts to 4 major economies. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister has said that what little trust there was with Iran has been completely shattered, and that both political and non-political responses to Iran remain on the table. This from a country that restored diplomatic relations with Iran in 2023 after years of painstaking negotiation. A diplomatic architecture that was incinerated in the opening days of a conflict Riyadh was not consulted about before it began. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated publicly that the war is risking to get out of control, causing immense suffering and dramatic effects on the global economy. Iran's President Pezeshkian warned that the strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure could have uncontrollable consequences, the scope of which could engulf the entire region. The gap between the official Washington characterization of short-term disruptions proceeding according to plan and the documented statements of Qatar's energy minister, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, the UN Secretary-General, and Iran's president is not a matter of emphasis or framing. It is a gap between institutional messaging and documented reality, and every decision about escalation, negotiation, and force commitment is being made against a backdrop of official assessments that the statements of Washington's own partners directly contradict. Qatar's response to the strikes on its facilities reveals something important about the position these Gulf states are now occupying, and about the trajectory of the alliance architecture that Washington has been relying on to sustain operations in this theater. Qatar expelled Iranian military and security attachés from Doha within 24 hours of the strikes, ordering them to leave immediately. Qatar condemned Iran's attack as a dangerous escalation, a flagrant violation of state sovereignty, and a direct threat to its national security. But Qatar also condemned Israel's original strike on South Pars as a dangerous and irresponsible step. Qatar's foreign ministry called it a threat to global energy security, and Qatar's energy minister gave a public interview describing in precise detail how he warned the United States almost daily, was ignored, and is now looking at 3 to 5 years of lost export capacity. Qatar is not breaking with the United States. It is not switching sides, but it is doing something that carries its own strategic weight. It is publicly documenting, on the record with specific details, that its explicit warnings were ignored by the American officials responsible for approving the decision that triggered the destruction of its infrastructure. That documentation is not a diplomatic protest. It is a public record, accessible to every government, every sovereign wealth fund manager, every long-term contract partner, every analyst calculating what American alliance commitments are actually worth in a conflict environment. Al-Khabi said, and the directness of this phrase is remarkable for a sitting energy minister of a U.S. partner state, "I never in my wildest dreams would have thought that Qatar would be in such an attack, especially from a brotherly Muslim country in the month of Ramadan, attacking us in this way." That statement was not made in a private diplomatic channel. It was made to Reuters, on the record, with his name attached. This is where the energy dimension of this conflict stands on March 20, 2026. 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity destroyed. Repairs projected 3 to 5 years. Force majeure being considered on contracts to Belgium, China, Italy, and South Korea. Oil above $110 per barrel. Saudi projection of $180 if disruptions persist into late April. European gas prices up 35% in a single trading day. The Strait of Hormuz closed to Western commercial shipping for more than 3 weeks. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery struck and taken offline. UAE's Habshan facility shut following Iranian missile debris. Kuwait's gas units targeted. Pentagon requesting $200 billion in emergency defense spending. Qatar Energy CEO on the record stating he warned American officials almost daily that they were aware of the threat, that they were always reminded, that the attack happened anyway. Trump publicly claiming the United States knew nothing. U.S. and Israeli officials confirming to multiple outlets that Trump approved the strike and coordinated it directly with Netanyahu. No ceasefire framework, no publicly acknowledged exit strategy, no honest accounting of what this conflict has cost and what it has produced. The world's largest gas reserve has now been struck by both sides of this conflict. The man who runs the facility that processes Qatar's share of that reserve warned Washington almost every day that this was coming. It came anyway. 3 questions now define the analytical picture. Whether Qatar's documented public record of ignored warnings accelerates the sovereign wealth fund withdrawal calculations that Gulf states have been running since the opening strikes of this conflict, and what that capital reallocation means for American financial markets. Whether force majeure declarations on LNG contracts to Belgium, China, Italy, and South Korea trigger the kind of sustained European energy crisis that generates direct political pressure on Washington from its NATO allies. Whether the gap between Trump's public claim of no prior knowledge and the documented record of coordination, now confirmed by multiple officials on both sides, produces the kind of domestic political accountability that changes the decision-making calculus on further escalation. The operational and economic record of this conflict has consistently moved faster than the official characterization. Subscribe to From Analysis and turn on notifications. When Qatar's force majeure decisions on European contracts are finalized, the analysis will be here. When the sovereign wealth fund withdrawal calculations produce their first visible market signals, the analysis will be here. When the oil price trajectory reaches the political threshold that changes what Washington is willing to do, the analysis will be here. This channel documents the gap between official characterization and operational reality, connects the military, economic, and diplomatic dimensions that daily coverage keeps artificially separate, and tells you what the assembled evidence actually shows. Evidence first, analysis second, what it means for you, always. This is From Analysis.